So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Joseph Chan, Professor of the Department of Politics and Public Administration at University of Hong Kong. You have his bio there, so there's no need for me to repeat it. I've known Professor Chan since 2000, when I first got into Hong Kong. By way of introduction, I'm going to tell two little stories about him. One is after I first met him, I mentioned you to Randy Parenboom. Now, if you don't know, Randy Parenboom is probably the most theoretically sophisticated and philosophically sophisticated China law scholar that the United States has produced prior to Norman Ho. And so Randy, I guess, had known you, and Randy said about Joseph, he says, Joseph is going to do for Confucianism what John Rawls did for liberalism. So that's, from Randy, that's compliment. Anyway, so that's the first story. Second story is we had coffee or something about a week after 9/11. And we had a discussion, because people probably forget, but right after 9/11 there was a volcano in South America which exploded and killed about 10,000 people. And I made the point, I said, look, I think the volcano was a greater tragedy than 9/11. And I said, someone else, I said, I don't think the simple fact that 9/11 was intentional and the volcano was not intentional, I don't think that it's still a bigger tragedy. About 3 months later, we're having coffee or something like that, and I make some statement about mens rea, about how it's important to take into account the fact that something is intentional. And Joseph remembered what I had said 3 months earlier and said, but that's not what you said 3 months earlier. Now you have to understand, at this time I was even more insignificant than I am now. And the fact that you could remember, that you took me seriously, I mean most people here know not to take me seriously, but the fact that you took someone you've never known and take them seriously, can remember that for 3 months and pay attention to it, I think is, well, very much along the lines of virtue, the mentor-mentee virtue that you're going to talk about today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mike, for that very kind introduction. I don't remember that moment now. When was it?
2001.
2001. Wow, amazing. I'm amazed by my memory. It's my great pleasure and honor to be with you here and to share with you my ongoing research. And for this, I am really grateful to Professor Michael Dodell, and who said that Professor James Penner recommended me as a potential speaker to this symposium. So I'm grateful to both. The paper that I gave you is a very short one, it's a rough draft. There are lots of gaps and lines of arguments not yet fully developed, so I really appreciate critical comments. And it is part of a bigger project to try to re-examine some fundamental democratic ideas in democratic theories. I can't assume that every one of you has read it. So, and also for the purpose of video taping here, I think I'm obliged to go through the paper one more time, so I apologize to those who have already done the reading. I apologize for making you go through the pain again of reading it or listening to it. But I will be as brief as I can. Let me just start off with stating the claims that I want to defend in this presentation, which is about hierarchy and equality. And I want to argue that hierarchy and equality per se are neither problematic nor praiseworthy. Whether they're good or bad, right or wrong, depend on the ways in which they operate and the ways in which their operation affect people's well-being and virtue. And so it also depends on whether or not certain desirable relationships are expressed in those operations. By equality, I'm referring to a recent school of theory called social egalitarianism or social equality, rather than the sort of much developed discussions on distributive equality. And according to social equality or social egalitarianism, what is fundamental is people's relationship to each other, that people should be related as equals, and then we'll explore the distributive implications of that fundamental relationship that we hold as important. And the theorists developing this traditional theorizing in recent years are Elizabeth Anderson, David Miller, Samuel Scheffler, and a number of other scholars as well. And in my presentation, I focus primarily on Anderson's writings. Well, social egalitarians have aimed their critiques at many different types of social equality. When they try to define social equality, they first and foremost define it negatively, in the sense that there are certain hierarchies that we find problematic and wrongful. And what are these hierarchies? Well, for example, Anderson describes 3 types of hierarchies that she finds problematic. Hierarchies of domination or command. In those hierarchies, those occupying inferior positions are subject to the arbitrary and unaccountable authority of social superiors, and thereby made powerless. Examples are slavery, for example. And then there are hierarchies of esteem. In those hierarchies, people occupying inferior positions are stigmatized. They're being treated as objects of dishonor, contempt, disgust, fear, or hatred. And there are also hierarchies of standing, which gives special weight to this interest of those occupying the higher ranks in decision making. They enjoy greater rights, privileges, opportunities, or benefits than those who occupy the inferior positions. And those people who occupy those inferior positions will have their interests being marginalized. So, if you look at a more formal definition that Anderson provides, she says that these hierarchies are problematic or unjust, primarily on the ground that these hierarchies are based on ascriptive group identities, like race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, things like that, or class system. And also because of the highly undesirable consequences these hierarchies produce. So it's both arbitrary in the sense of that distribution of benefits are based on morally arbitrary ascriptive factors, as well as undesirable consequences produced by them. But I think there's no reason to define hierarchy in such a pejorative and narrow manner. And of course, if you look at hierarchies of this kind, then, and if you look at equality of a very lofty kind, then you can naturally come to the conclusion that equality is better than hierarchy. But I think it is only fair to compare like with like and dislike with dislike. Compare equality in the ideal situation with hierarchy in the ideal situation, as well as those two things in non-ideal situations. So, but to do so, we need a more descriptive, neutral definition so that we can look at both ideal and non-ideal versions of the thing that we examine. And so I think we first of all have to start with a neutral definition. And here I'd like to suggest one, which is that a social relationship, hierarchy is a social relationship that ranks its participants with respect to their relative possession of a valued feature. And let me just elaborate a little bit. That relationship can be embedded in an informal group or a formal group like an organization. And the relationship has to be a durable one. It's not just one-off or two times, 3 times, over a period of time in which there are numerous interactions between participants. And in that hierarchy, there is ranking of participants, and those ranking could be implicit, that we understand this is how we treat each other, but it could also be explicit. And the valued features refer to the certain competences or excellences decided by the social relationship or the participants in it. And naturally, in a hierarchy, usually the higher rank has more things than others, whether esteem or power or sort of resources or positions. Now, given this definition, then an unequal distribution of esteem as such is not yet a hierarchy of esteem. Because if you look at simply the winners of the sport game, there's hierarchy of esteem between, the first prize and the third prize, but there's inequality of esteem, but there's no hierarchy, because if they don't interact with each other at all. So when we talk about hierarchy, we need to talk about enduring relationship. But when we have an enduring relationship, then we can examine that relationship and ask whether the relationship exists for good reasons and whether it produces good consequences. So we could, I think, imagine at least a benevolent esteem hierarchy. For example, those in the higher rank are committed to the betterment of those in the lower ranks. And there's reciprocity of roles and duties, as well as mutual commitment to excellences as common goods. And so, this sort of hierarchy, this understanding of hierarchy, benevolent hierarchy, comes from Confucianism. All traditions of liberal thought, Confucianism gives the clearest description of such an ideal of hierarchy that could be perhaps philosophically or normatively defensible. And let me just flesh out a little bit, the background ideas of Confucianism in order to make sense of this sort of hierarchy. First is the idea of Confucian perfectionism. That is to say, according to Confucianism, society and politics exist for the good life of the people. And then each person has worth, because each person has the potential to become a fully human in all its capacities and potentialities. And so each person's life matters, and each should have the opportunities to learn and pursue his or her own life. And so this is the basic ideas. Without these ideas, you can easily have a hierarchy that is utterly oppressive, ignoring the interests of the lower rank. And that is not acceptable to Confucianism, because the lower ranks lives matter, because they have the potential to grow and to participate in the common life of the community. And then there is another dimension, which is the understanding that the good life is a matter of lifelong learning. By learning, I don't simply mean cognitive, intellectual, but also ethical learning, aesthetic learning, physical learning, and those aspects of our capacities. So the pursuit of good life requires intelligent learning, which is a cooperative endeavor and a lifelong process. But in this process, inevitably there are people who are more advanced than us, either because of inborn talent or because of the fact that some people pay more effort into it, or they got more luck because they have, they are raised in better families or whatever reasons. For Confucianism, the correct response to this unequal distribution of talents is not to celebrate it, saying this is very good, I'm better than you. It's not like that, or condemn it. Unlike some people, the fact that I'm better than you is something I have to be apologetic, I have to defend. Not that, but it's just make use of this factual inequality for the common pursuit of the good life. So Confucians take a more pragmatic approach to this unequal distribution of talents in society. And society is viewed as a community of learners rather than as a community of equals to take part in the collective pursuit of the good life. Now, so given these two basic set of ideas, then let's come to understand the ideal notion of Confucian hierarchy, which is marked by reciprocity and mutual concern. So the relationship is this, that the more advanced in learning, whether ethical, intellectual, or in other dimensions, they care for the less advanced, they help them learn and show appreciation of the less advanced talents and efforts. And then the less advanced in return show their admiration and respect for such care and concern, and also for the more advanced ability. So it's a reciprocal relationship, but not equal. It's hierarchical, but it's defined by some sharing of mutual roles. And there's a mutual commitment, which could be deeply satisfying to each participant's good life. Well, this is already very lofty ideal, high sounding, and in reality it could degenerate into something pretty nasty or ugly. But if we try to stick to the original aspiration of Confucianism, there are several features of Confucianism, of understanding of society and learning, that would, to some extent, prevent Confucian hierarchies from degeneration. First is the notion of virtue. Because Confucianism thinks that the participants, especially those more advanced people, have the responsibility to develop virtue, and they also should be virtuous in other regards. And so virtuous would not seek to oppress or humiliate others. And the second main element is the Confucian understanding of learning, which is not sort of oppressive or paternalistic, but actually quite dynamic and active, and both ways. I've made some references to the text. I don't want to repeat them here. Unlike some stereotypical understanding of Confucian learning, it is there is a strong emphasis on enlightenment. And the role of learning could be changing. So I could be your mentor in music, while you can be my mentor in playing table tennis, for example. So Confucianism doesn't look for a compound notion of hierarchies, that one person occupies a higher position in all kinds of hierarchies. And thirdly, because of these two ideas, there's always a tendency for Confucianism to drive people to grow and excel in this inquiry of learning. And if there are any inequalities of power, status, or esteem, they are justified to the extent that these inequalities are embedded in the relationships of reciprocity, mutual concern, and virtue, and that these inequalities work for the advantage of the less advanced in terms of their learning. So this sounds a bit like Rawls's difference principle, although of course Rawls's principle deals with economic inequality, and here I deal with the general notion of hierarchies. I'm not criticizing Rawls, of course, I'm just trying to compare a little bit. I noticed he deals with something else. For Rawls, the difference principle rests on some kind of a normative default, that is equality. And inequality is acceptable only to the extent that it benefits to the greater the extent of the worse off. But for Confucianism, at least when it comes to learning, that equality is not the default, and inequality is not to bring about equality as such. Because a mentor in Confucianism doesn't simply want to produce an equal to him. He wants the mentee to grow and to surpass him one day. So it is this upward inequality that is aimed by Confucianism. That is to say, progress that upsets initial inequality. That is good. And stagnant inequality, or stagnant equality, whatever way, is bad or not good enough. Of course, in reality, not all of the advanced in the hierarchy are virtuous. We all know that. And so when we lower our sight and think about the non-ideal situation, how should we protect hierarchies from degeneration? And unfortunately, classical Confucianism didn't talk too much about this, and we have to draw on our contemporary experiences from any tradition, from modern society. And this idea is pretty simple, that we should introduce checks and balances, like exit rights, like complaint rights, external checks. And the example I have, is graduate supervision. So if my supervisee doesn't like me, he could exit. He could go to the chairman of the postgraduate committee and to change the supervisor. And at the end, his thesis will be examined by another person, not myself, and things like that. So to secure this, you need a liberal society with civil liberties, with freedom of association, so that people can exit the association that they join. Without those liberal civil liberties that it's very hard to ensure that checks and balances are effective. So, but these measures, I want to emphasize, need not be motivated by egalitarian impulses. The motivation is not to ensure equality of any kind to the participant. It's just to protect the least advantaged or the less advanced from being exploited by the upper advanced, the more advanced. So that's it for the first part. But social egalitarians might consider, well, what you say is may be acceptable when it comes to civil society, arts group, learning groups, academia, and dancing groups or whatnot. But when it comes to politics, we cannot possibly accept any political hierarchy. Democratic equality, instead, is the only acceptable relationship in that political sphere. And Elizabeth Anderson makes this sort of claims and defends it. She says that democratic equality denotes a kind of standing in civil society to make claims on others. Each person has the authority to make claims on others and to have claims to power. That is, each person has the authority to participate in collective decision-making processes that shapes each other's common life. And so she thinks that this notion of democratic equality, understood as political equality, one person, one vote, is both a principle of rightness, that is, this represent democratic rights that people should have. It's also a principle of goodness, that is, it produces desirable relationship of equality that enhances people's well-being and good lives. So it's both a matter of democratic right and democratic good. I will deal with the notion of right first. It is a hugely controversial issue. I don't pretend that I have a knockdown argument. I just want to introduce an alternative perspective. No doubt it requires a great deal of elaboration and defense than I could give in the paper. But just let me try tentatively an alternative view. Again, drawn from Confucianism. For Confucianism, political power or rights as attached to political authority are justified by two conditions. I'm summarizing my theory in my book called Confucian Perfectionism. First is service condition. The second is the expressive condition. Service condition says that a political arrangement is good, is acceptable to the extent that it serves the well-being of the people, of those participants in that relationship. It enhances their well-being, broadly conceived, including the good life virtues and things like that, according to Confucianism. Depending on what philosophy of good life you subscribe, then you may have a different understanding of the list of things that evaluate the effectiveness of the service. But this is the instrumental dimension, so to speak, to the justification of authority. But Confucianism also has an expressive dimension in this justification. It is not only that I have to effectively serve it, but the relationship between you and me, suppose I am the governor and you are the governed, then there should be a mutual trust between you and I, mutual commitment to each other's roles and duties. So I'm committed to advancing your well-being, and you are committed to supporting voluntarily my governing, because you trust that I'm an effective and trustworthy leader, and I have, in my track record, displayed and earned that trust of you. But if you just simply look at the service condition alone, then I would argue that one implication or corollary of that condition is a very interesting one, controversial but very provocative. That is, all political rights and offices must meet the service condition because that is a necessary condition for political authority. That is to say that no one actually, whether citizens or leaders or monarchs or sons of a monarch, can claim any moral entitlement to political rule simply because they hold certain position in society. The fact that they are given political rights is justified only as part of a larger political arrangement which is justifiable by the surface condition. So for Confucians, political right is first and foremost a responsibility, not a privilege. And I will come to this again. So, but to see the special nature of political rights as responsibility rather than an entitlement, we should compare personal rights of a non-political kind with political rights. A personal right protects the right holder's fundamental interests, such as right against torture. But a political right gives the right holder the power to affect people's life, to direct people's life. So even in a democracy, there are numerous voters, but jointly, their rights could create tremendous impact on other voters, as well as on non-voters, residents who don't have the right to vote. And so, according to Confucianism, this bit of the power of the right to vote, power on others, requires justification of a kind that is different from the justification we give to personal rights of humankind, like fundamental right not to be tortured. And the justification has to be tested by the surface condition, as I said. So Confucianism therefore rejects democratic equality as a principle of moral rightness. It itself cannot be standing on its own. It has to pass certain conditions, independent conditions. I'm not saying that Confucianism would necessarily reject one person, one vote, or democratic political institutions. They could be justified under favorable conditions by the two conditions, by the expressive and the surface conditions. But in any case, the right to vote is seen as just a part of an overall political arrangement that is part of a project that can be justified by independent hands. Now, but egalitarians will say, well, even if I grant you that, I like to think, I want to argue that, as egalitarians, any hierarchical political system must be defective, must be unacceptable. And I challenge that in my paper. I gave a highly idealized case of monarchy as a matter of argument in ideal situation that I think is pretty attractive and nothing philosophical normative defective. Suppose you have a competent and fully virtuous and trustworthy monarch who allows for expression of speech. There may be conflict of interest, and people trust that the monarch will listen, consult, and deliberate carefully, and make impartial judgments. The monarch may make mistakes, but the citizens know that they may make more mistakes than the monarch, but the monarch welcomes feedback. And the citizens are given opportunities to make decisions in civil societies, in voluntary associations, and things like that. So there's opportunities for citizens to learn to make decisions as well. So in this situation, I think I can think of no fundamental reason for thinking that a monarchy of this kind is, as a matter of rights, objectionable. What about the good of democratic equality? According to Anderson, there are two kinds of good. First, it avoids the sort of common evils that we found in undemocratic societies, like cruelty, abuse of power, humiliation. And she thinks that by giving people equal standing, those evils could be more or less avoided. And I happen to think that, it depends on the circumstances. It's not necessarily that it's always the democratic solution is the only effective solution. And there are another kind of goods promoted by democratic equality, namely sympathy and solidarity and feeling of unity with others, which Anderson claims which is possible only in a society of equals. Again, I'm not fully convinced by that. I think we could experience sympathy, solidarity, and feeling of unity in hierarchical bodies like a military unit, work team in a business firm, SWAT team, clan, things like that. What is important is there is common participation in a common life with shared goals and some common spirits rather than a strict relationship of equality. Now, social egalitarians typically respond by pointing out that pointing out the defects and vices of unhealthy hierarchical relationships in non-ideal situations. And it's quite right. Yes, there are lots of such things. But if they are fair, they should also acknowledge the defects and vices of unhealthy equal relationships in non-ideal situations as well. And there are lots of this too. So, for example, there's a tendency for theorists of equality to play down the costs or bad consequences of political equality. And I gave some recent examples in the paper, the Brexit and the election of Trump and the upsurge of populism throughout Europe, and a lot of other cases where the majority did not fully respect the minority or exercise their right to vote in a reasonable manner. Participation may be a solution. If you put them in participation, they will more or less in the long run learn to behave civilly, to get themselves informed, and to acquire a more serious understanding of their responsibility as citizens. But empirically, this is not a very strongly supported claim. Rather, it seems to a lot of empirical political scientists that participation presupposes civility and virtues in order for it to work, rather than produce or breed civility and virtues themselves. So let me just now conclude that I think political relationships, whether they're equal or hierarchical, need virtues to function well. When there's no virtue, democratic equality or Confucian hierarchy will lose their attraction. They will degenerate into highly undesirable relationships and produce bad outcomes. And I think Confucianism and Western republicanism understand this point well. Sorry, the word Western, just republicanism. Confucianism emphasizes the need for the leaders to have virtue because they live in hierarchical societies. And the analect says, without virtue, leaders will fail to govern, and people simply would not obey. Republicanism, on the contrary, stresses the need for citizens to have virtues. And James Madison, for example, says, if people have no virtue, then no Republican or any kind of government can render us secure in our pursuit of freedom and happiness. So the ideal solution, of course, is to combine the insight of both Confucianism and republicanism. And so just to conclude, I think it is hierarchies, social equalities or hierarchies are not good or bad in themselves. They're good and right to the extent that they express a satisfying relationship, mutual commitment and trust, and that they promote the well-being of the participants. But if there's no virtue in the participants, to suppose that any equality or hierarchy will secure the rights or supply the good is a chimerical idea. So that's the main idea of the paper.